Ymedia.
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 Stay tuned with Ymedia.
Ymedia is a media company. With 360-degree approach in reaching the audience over 8 media platforms.
Hello and welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I am Ramona Singh, and we're talking about what's been taking place between the United States and Canada when it comes to this trade war. And the auto sector is one of the biggest contentious issues. And to that, you have Honda that is warning this trade war could drive up car prices. They're saying that, well, essentially they may need to raise the vehicle prices or even suspend further North American factory expansions if Canada and the United States fail to reach a new trade agreement. Because while Honda relies heavily on the integrated Canada and US automotive supply chains, and when it comes to components that can cross the border several times, which is something that we know and we've heard from the auto industry many, many times, and this happens several times across the border during the vehicle production. So now Honda is Canada's second largest vehicle manufacturer in terms of production volume, and the company may delay additional North American plants because they're saying, hey, how are we going to do business if we're talking about a 50% tariff or even any additional amount? So now tariffs could increase the cost of manufacturers, dealers, as well as the end consumer, you and I. And so the American auto industries operate as this integrated system, right? So any tariffs applied at any multiple point, whether it's a Canadian component or an American component, that could essentially compound the costs. And then it's just, in this case for Honda, they're saying we're not going to be competitive compared to the other brands that we compete with heavily, right? You have Honda and Toyota that compete pretty much in the market. And so that's one of the major issues. And then, of course, there is the whole support Canada, buy Canada. And this has been something that has really been a movement that started with President Trump's second term, as when he got, he inaugurated, and when he entered the Oval Office, he announced a 25% tariff on Canada. And then if you recall the rhetoric on Governor Trudeau and recently Governor Carney, 51st state, we don't need Canada for anything. Well, that really sprung upon Support Canada. So now you have Loblaws that is going to bring back the origin and tariff labels as this Buy Canadian movement has gone to another level with this latest tariff wars that we are witnessing. So now Loblaws is reversing its decision to remove the country of origin information from the produce display, as well as what would be in terms of the complaints that they got from customers seeking to avoid any American products. And, they just don't want to support American products, and they want to support Canadian producers. So when you go into a grocery store and you're looking at the table of apples and oranges and fruits and vegetables and every other product, well, Canadians are saying they want to know what they're buying. And it's very hard to pick up, let's, for example, an apple and try to see the label of where it's from. Why not when you have the signs right there where it has the pricing for the said apple, then it could identify where it's from. So now the retailer is going to restore the T symbol, and the T symbol identifies products that are imported directly from the United States that are affected by Canadian tariffs. So in case you see that apple and you see why is it so expensive, then you'll see the T and know that it's tariffed apple. And so Loblaws will reinstate origin of country information on produce signs. And this information also had remained in Ontario and Quebec because of the provincial labeling requirements. But this is important because now we're in this new era of, let's support Canadian products, and let's know, we don't want to in this case, Canadians are saying they don't want to indirectly support Canadian products when, when they can, sorry, American products when they can make sure that is a homegrown product. So this is important when it comes to understanding labels and what this means. When it comes to a product of Canada, well, virtually all significant ingredients, or when it comes to processing and labor, are Canadian is important. So generally, at least 98% of direct product costs must be incurred in Canada, is what it means of to have a label of product of Canada. But when you see a label of made in Canada, that means the product's final substantial transformation occurred in Canada. And at least 51% of the direct production costs were incurred here in Canada, and also must include qualifiers such as made in Canada from domestic and imported ingredients. And then there's the third label, which is prepared in Canada, and that is the broad description that says essentially some preparation occurred in Canada. It does not necessarily mean that the principal ingredients are Canadian. And then you also have, for example, maple leaf and retailer symbols that are now voluntary marketing or any identification tools. They also depend on the same criteria. So having the T symbol is an indicator of essentially this is a product directly imported from the United States, and therefore it is affected by the Canadian tariffs. Now, this Buy Canadian movement is important because therefore you need the food labeling and hey, aside from this economic factor, it has now become a political factor where Canadians just want to support Canadian products. And to that, what's happening now is, of course, polls are showing us how Canadians feel and what is the consensus. The latest polls are finding that Canadians are angry but are united over the US trade war when it comes to what the Prime Minister did in terms of standing up to President Trump. Now, a new Angus Reid Institute survey finds that Canadians are increasingly angry, frustrated, and anxious about prolonged trade disputes with the United States. And this is despite the widespread concerns about, the economic damage, right? So you have 69% of them want their provincial governments to prioritize a unified Team Canada approach over individual provincial interests. So they don't want it to be a case where Alberta is saying, you know what, we're not going to have the same approach as the rest of Canada because we, have a oil sector, it being the massive economy of Alberta, not being affected by the tariffs, and they don't want to really damage the relationship with the Americans, and so therefore they're not supporting, the Ontario auto sector, for example. And so this is something that Canadians are saying they want all the provinces to be on the same page and not fight with each other. Actually, Angus Reid put up, we have the graphics that will show you what they did was because of their poll, they were able to, use AI to see how Canadians feel on certain issues and a breakdown of how they're feeling about the trade war that's taking place, and then distinguishing, what are their political leanings, if they're liberal, conservative, and whatnot. So we have that graphic, which we'll show you right now, and therefore you could see how Canadians feel when it comes to this Angus Reid poll that was done. And then you have the themes of, frustration, anger, anxiety. So if we can please put that up, I can go over what is the findings of this poll by Angus Reid. That's quite critical. So we'll just wait for the control room to put that up, and I'll go over it in quite detail when it's ready. And then you could see that you have the breakdown of how Canadians feel. So there you have it. So here's the theme, right? How do Canadians feel? They feel frustration and anger. In terms of the respondents, it was about 19% of the respondents, so the highest amount, which is where that headline came from with the frustration and anger. When you break it down to who are those 19% of respondents, 21% of the 19% were liberals. 20% conservative. So you're not really seeing much of a difference between liberals and conservatives in terms of how they feel, in terms of being frustrated and angry over this latest tariff war. And then the NDP falls at 17% and the Bloc Québécois at 11%. And then the next item of how do Canadians feel right now, in terms of anxiety, worry, or fear, it came to the 8%. And to that, you're seeing almost the same consistencies of the liberals and conservatives, feeling the same thing with the anxiety, worry, fear. What does this mean for the economy? What does it mean with this unaffordability crisis that we're having? What does it mean for jobs in those specific industries? And of course, if job cuts happen, then that affects the household income, right? And then there's disappointment. Yeah, I mean that's a natural feeling of, hey, there was trade talks taking place between the two countries for quite some time, and then you wake up on Saturday morning, which you thought there was going to be a deal, and then lo and behold, on August 22nd, which was the deadline, you have this 50% tariff, which really impacts, United States is Canada's first and biggest consumer. 70 to 75% of Canadian goods go to the United States. So when you have a 50% tariff on some key sectors, yeah, you're going to be disappointed that the negotiations fell through. And then there's pride and patriotism, right? Support Canada, which is this entire movement of making sure that Canadian producers are selling to Canadian consumers. You have this 5%, but out of that 5%, you're seeing it 9% are liberal leaning, which is the pride is coming forward, and perhaps also very happy with the Prime Minister's approach of not being bullied by President Trump. And then you have the Conservatives, NDP, and the Bloc sitting at the 1 to 3%. And then, of course, with anything that comes with anxiety, worry, and fear, you're going to have uncertainty and confusion of what this means for your sector. That sat at 4%. And then you're seeing that whole anti-US, anti-Trump sentiment, 3%. Exhaustion and fatigue. I mean, how much are we going to just talk about, 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, and hearing President Trump talk about, Canada being the 51st state, or then the Kuzma negotiations falling through and going through an annual review and not being, implemented for 16 years, but now it fell through, and now you have this 50% tariff. So yeah, it's quite exhausting, and there's a lot of fatigue in there. You have, hope, resolve, determination is at 3%. Interesting emotion discussed with what is happening with this latest administration, 2%. Betrayal, distrust, again, 2%. Sadness, of course, these are all emotions that really coincide with one another at 2%. And then you have the indifference and apathy at 1%. So very low compared to the frustration, anger at 19%. And then the disbelief and shock, here you have it at 1%. So that is what came up with the Angus Reid poll, identifying in terms of how people responded. Now, going back to what this means, from this poll, about 69% want the provinces to have this united Canada approach. 66% believe that the dispute will badly affect their province. And when it comes to provincial concerns, the highest are in Quebec at 76%, Ontario at 70%, British Columbia at 68%, and 19% describe their reaction primary, which we just went through, as frustration or anger. And then there's the breakdown that we just went through. So this is quite significant about what's taking place. When you combine the measures of, when it comes to anxiety, fear, and uncertainty, it becomes quite significant, because you have 51% that want tariff assistance funded by and directly existing spending. And then you also have 11% that favor borrowing to finance assistance, which is this part of the contribution of what the Ottawa is going to do with the $7.5 billion assistance package. And 6% out of that said they want to support raising taxes, and 16% oppose significant government financial assistance. So it's quite significant, because when you do the political breakdown of, out of those respondents, where do they lean? About 91% of them are Liberal voters that support Team Canada approach. 70% are NDP voters, and you have 69% who are Bloc Québécois voters. And among the Conservatives, you have 48% that favor the Team Canada approach, and 43% want provinces to prioritize their own interests. And so out of that 43% that want provinces to prioritize their own interests, so that would be different for Canada, which for in the Canadian provinces, where in Ontario you have the auto sector, and then in Alberta, for example, the oil and gas sector. So that would be each province prioritizing their own interest, and not having a Team Canada approach of, having the same messaging put forward. When it comes to regional support for unity, it ranges about 57% in Saskatchewan and 75% in Manitoba. So this is where things are at when it comes to how Canadians actually feel about the latest trade war. Now, this survey by Angus Reid was conducted online on August 22nd and 24th between those days. And the sample size is 1,770 Canadian adults. And these respondents draw from the Angus Reid Forum, and the results were weighted by region, age, gender, household income, and education. And so this is how it feels in terms of how Canadians are responding on some of those issues, which is quite important to be able to know what the consensus is. And this is perhaps what Ottawa is looking at. What do Canadians want and what is taking place? Now, there's also a Nanos poll, and that shows the difference on the latest research federal tracking poll that's taken place, that where you have Liberals at 44% and 14 percentage points ahead of the Conservatives at 30%. So Nanos is essentially tracking how do people feel about, the Liberals as well as the Conservatives. And so you have a high tracking. The Liberals are at 44% and the Conservatives are at 30%. When it comes to Prime Minister Mark Carney, who also holds a commanding advantage over Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, he is the preferred Prime Minister. So when you look at what is taking place in terms of the tracking support for the parties, as well as the leaders of those parties, you have the Liberals at the 44%, and the change from the August 14th, so earlier on, it was, it's gone down about 1.6%. And then for the Conservatives at 30% support, it actually went up 1.5%. The NDP is at 13%, and the Bloc Québécois is at 6%. When it comes to Greens, they're at 4%, and the People's Party stay consistently at the 2%. Now, the Liberal lead over the Conservatives is 14 percentage points, and the Liberal support has declined modestly since the end of July. Well, that's natural, but we're seeing the latest bump in what is taking place with Prime Minister Mark Carney in his announcements on stopping the negotiations with the Americans, and now we're seeing the United States come back and say, okay, we're not going to use French language and the Canadian culture issues as a tariff contentious issue. And then also having President Trump saying, yeah, you know what, the United States did put some last minute things forward, also shows goodwill to Prime Minister Mark Carney that, yeah, he was saying the truth, even because nobody was in the room, right, other than these negotiators, which is why you have the Conservatives, who are the official opposition, who are saying we need to see what took place in that room, what was on the table, what was being proposed. Now, when it comes to the preferred Prime Minister, Mark Carney is at 50%, Pierre Poilievre is at 19%, and the NDP's Abby Lewis is at 5%. The Greens' Elizabeth May is at 3%, and Yves-François Blanchet, the Bloc leader, is at 3%. And Maxime Bernier, which is the People's Party, is at 2%. And when it comes to unsure who would be the best prime minister in terms of the leaders from each party, there is 17% who are unsure. And so this is showing Prime Minister Mark Carney has pretty good support when it comes to some of these numbers. Now, when it comes on the issues of what Nanos tracked, on jobs and economy, it's sitting at 20%. When it comes to Trump relations, the US relations, that's at 15%. And inflation is concerning Canadians at 11%, healthcare at 6%, environment at 6%, immigration at 5%. Housing cost of housing is at 5%, and high taxes is at 2%, crime at 2%, national unity at 1.6%. So really the big issues here are jobs and economy. When you have a tariff war, it's going to impact industries, and those industries will impact the jobs, and as job shrinks and it creates things to become more expensive, of course, it also impacts the economy. So that is 20% of what Canadians are worried about when it comes to issues. And this is a poll that was done on August 21st, very recent. And then of course you can't be worrying about jobs and the economy without really thinking about President Trump and the United States as our biggest trading partner, which falls at 15%. And then second to that is we know inflation, things get more expensive, inflation increases, rises, and therefore you have that 11% for inflation. So it's very interesting, when it comes to healthcare, environment, immigration, housing, it's sitting at 6% to about 5%. And that is what Canadians are really concerned about when it comes to the state of affairs in Canada. What does this mean when it comes to the future of Canada, the economy, jobs, affordability, and so this is going to be very interesting. There is three by-elections at the end of August. So determine, and by-elections are essentially a report card on the governing party. So the Liberals. So it'll be very interesting to see, will the Liberals take those three seats? What's going to take place? And many more to come, because these are times where people are paying attention. Now, when it comes to the Nanos poll, it was a survey of 4 weekly waves that ended on August 21st. The sample size is 1,022 Canadian adults, and the ballot sample was 875 decided voters, and the method was live agent telephone interviews that were conducted to figure out how do Canadians feel about what is taking place. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.